And Larson's protagonist, Helga Crane, was considered to be something of an oddball nonconformist who bucked the black authenticity police, not only because she was openly disdainful of organized religion, but also because she was a biracial woman who was struggling to achieve a sense of self and identity betwixt and between two very different cultures, that of 1920s predominantly African-American Harlem and Copenhagen, Denmark, which was the country of her mother's birth. And she traveled between the two cultures. And so, in one really illuminating passage, Helga decries what she perceives to be the absurdity of black slavish devotion to the white man's God. Black devoutness struck her as odd, given the depth of black poverty. Religious devotion was dysfunctional for black people because it blunted the perceptions, it robbed life of its crudest truths. Religion especially had its uses for the poor, for the blacks, how the white man's God must laugh at the great joke he played on them, bound them to slavery, then to poverty and insult, and made them bear it. And so, Helga's rejection of the Christian entreaty to take the possibility of redemption on faith, despite unrelenting earthly evil, misery, and suffering, becomes the catalyst for her retreat from the religious dogma of the African American community. After the book's publication, Anella Larson's probing exploration of the ministry was uneasily received by some. As a woman who, quote, did not believe in religion herself and was considered unconventional for the period, Larson defied the bourgeois religious faith and bucked conventional gender norms epitomized by the sacrificial good woman. A recurring theme in both Larson's Quicksand and her 1928 novel Passing is the gulf between society's narrow expectations and her female protagonist's sense of self and subjectivity. In this regard, Quicksand is a stunningly contemporary indictment of black parochialism and moral repression. And so Larson's book encapsulates many of the themes and issues that the young A. Philip Randolph struggled with early on in his career, both as an organizer and an intellectual. But Randolph was effectively forced to downplay his secularism in light of the realities of the era. And the realities of the era were that African Americans were systematically excluded from white-dominated social, political, and economic institutions. And as a result, the black church played a towering role in political organizing, in providing African American professionals with the kind of ties that they needed to, quote unquote, move into the black middle class, in laying a foundation for every aspect of civic engagement, and in providing social welfare resources for African Americans of all classes. And so, as a result, Randolph and his colleagues go on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was one of the most influential African American trade unions in American history. And they were motivated to do so by the deep and intractable white supremacy and racism of the labor movement in the United States, personified by the American Federation of Labor. And so the BSCP worked very strenuously to establish ties within the black faith community. But they were met with skepticism and resistance from some of the more conservative black congregations who were allied with the Pullman Company Union. And the Pullman Company Union had worked very vigorously to portray the BSCP as this hotbed of communism and radicalism, and atheism as well. And so Randolph, according to many biographers, retreats from many of his more radical positions on what he perceived to be the insidiousness of organized religion and the fixation on this theme of redemptive suffering within the African American community. And of course, Randolph goes on to found the March on Washington movement in the 1940s, initially to protest the exclusion of African Americans from wartime industries and the segregation of black troops. And so Randolph is part of the vanguard of African American intellectuals and activists who actively espoused secular humanist principles of social justice. And their ranks included W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an active a critic of American imperialism and colonialism, in addition to third world missionary incursions led by the U.S. James Foreman, a one-time head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also a very staunch critic of American imperialism and colonialism, in addition to being a critic of what he perceived to be the venality of black prosperity gospel preachers and the hypocrisy of the black church. Writers like Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and Richard Wright were all forerunning free thinkers who actively challenged the hold that the black church had on the black imagination and black political radicalism. Zora Neale Hurston was also an early African-American womanist and feminist advocate of free thought, intellectualism, and critical thinking in her nonfiction and fiction. And so the common theme amongst all of these thinkers and activists is a connection between capitalism, the hold that religiosity has on the black imagination with regard to black subjectivity and radicalism, and white supremacy. This has been a recurring theme within African-American secular humanist discourse. And I think it's a theme that really distinguishes it from the trajectory of the new atheist movement here in the 21st century. And so, fast forward into the 21st century. There are no African Americans who are willing to assume the mantle of secularism, much less atheism or humanism, and this is part and parcel of the hysterical political atmosphere that has been strategically cultivated by the far-right reactionary attack dogs of the Fox regime. Michelle Bachmann, Glenn Beck, Newt Gingrich, the medievalist Sarah Palin have all sought to relentlessly connect liberal public policies, not radical public policies. Healthcare, of course, is being the font of socialism and communism. These liberal public policies with godlessness and anti-Americanism. And Newt Gingrich has even gone so far as to designate Barack Obama as the architect of the so-called secular socialist conspiracy, which on the face of it is patently egregious because Obama, of course, is very corporate identified, very imperialist, has extended the Bush regime, and very publicly Christian identified. But it really does not matter because the stagecraft, the cultural propaganda of the far-right reactionary attack dogs of the Fox regime are not just targeting Obama and his secularism, but there's also a critique, a canard against his quote-unquote racial otherness, a demonization of his racial otherness, as per the images that I just showed. And so it really does not matter how much Obama attempts to portray himself as a good uber-Christian who can cozy up with homophobes like the evangelical preacher Rick Warren, or how much he greenlights Bush's faith-based initiative regime, or how much he eloquently evokes scripture in his public addresses. He'll never be Christian enough for the white heartland. He'll never be secular or American enough for the birther Confederate reactionaries. And he'll never, ever be white enough to pass because within the white supremacist cultural logic of American ideology, one drop, if you're a black appearing person in the United States and you're walking down the street in South LA or in Detroit or Milwaukee, Wisconsin or Chicago or Harlem, one drop still makes you whole.